Fortresses are thus useful or not according to the times, and if they do well for you in one regard, they hurt you in another. And one may discuss the issue thus. The prince, who has more fear of the people than of foreigners, ought to make fortresses, but the one who has more fear of foreigners than of the people ought to omit them. The castle in Milan, built by Francesco Sforza, has brought and will bring more war to the Sforza house than any other disorder of that state. Therefore, the best fortress there is not to be hated by the people, because although you may have fortresses, if the people hold you in hatred, fortresses do not save you. For to peoples who have taken up arms, foreigners will never be lacking to come to their aid. In our times, fortresses have not been seen to bring profit to any prince, unless to the Countess of Forli, when Count Girolamo, her consort, died, for by means of a fortress she was able to escape a popular uprising, to await help from Milan, and to recover her state. And the times then were such that a foreigner could not help the people. But later, fortresses were worth little to her when Cesare Borgia attacked her, and her hostile people joined with the foreigner. Therefore, then and before, it would have been more secure for her not to be hated by the people than to have had fortresses. Okay, this passage highlights several things that I think are characteristic of Machiavelli's thought and mode of operation when he is discussing politics. First of all, you get a sense that everything is conjunctural. All measures, all techniques. So fortresses are useful sometimes, they are not useful at other times. It's always specific to the context. So Machiavelli always avoids expounding general truths and always sort of customizes his reflections to the specificity of the case, to the concrete character of the particular context in which he is discussing. So the particularities are extremely important, and they are the driving force of his reflections. Now, in a few lines above the passage that I quoted, he says, "I praise this mode because it has been used since antiquity." So he always frames his reflections by reference to the past as something that should be emulated, something that should be learned from. But we quickly understand that the relevance of the past is not simply for imitation. It has a different function when it sheds light on the present. So he says that the fortress is important mainly for two reasons. One is to dishearten potential attackers, potential outside enemies, and in case of an attack, and this is the second function, it creates a shield of protection, especially if the attack is sudden. So the way in which, right before the passage, he formulates the necessity of fortresses is mainly to highlight its function vis-a-vis external enemies. Actually, earlier in the text, there's a section where he praises German towns, for example, for the fact that they are well fortified and therefore not very prone to the attacks of foreigners. So all of what I've said until now seems to support that he is unconditionally in favor of fortresses. But very quickly he changes territory, he changes terrain. He makes the argument, and this is the beginning of the quote that I read, that fortresses are useful or not according to the times. So very quickly we get a sense that all of what he has said above was provisional, that we have to now look at the real function of of the fortress in order to understand whether or not it is really necessary and profitable. Towards the end of the quote that I read, he mentioned that in our times, fortresses have not been seen to bring profit to any prince. So from an affirmation, we went to a provisionality, and then suddenly we arrive at a place through the use of examples interwoven through the text to a place where from the present the fortresses do not seem to bring profit, but rather appear as problematic politically. There is an exception, the Countess of Forli, who Machiavelli says was able to save herself from a popular uprising in the beginning by shielding herself in the fortress, but this was a temporary success, because soon after, when there was an external enemy, a foreign attack, foreign in the sense of not from Forli, but in this case Cesare Borgia, she was unable to sustain that attack. So the use of this example is really interesting because on the one hand, it seems to be an exception to the fact that fortresses are not useful in the present by saying, well, the Countess was able to shield herself from a popular uprising. But really, it quickly drives home Machiavelli's main point, which is that a prince or a princess should build a fortress only when there is something to be feared from the people. So, especially if the fear of the people is more than the fear of the external enemy. So, and I repeat this part, the best fortress there is not to be hated by the people. Because although you may have fortresses, if the people hold you in hatred, fortresses do not save you. So really, we very quickly come to understand that the fortress is never a substitute for the friendship of the people. So what does this do? It complicates the function of fortresses, because initially the functions of the fortress were mainly external, an act of deterrence against the external enemy, or an act of shielding in the case of a sudden attack. Suddenly, we come to realize that the fortress has an internal function, and perhaps that internal function is more important than the external function. And the internal function of the fortress is to be an index of the relationship of the ruler to the people. So, the best form of rule, of course, is not to be hated. So in a different chapter of The Prince, very well known, Machiavelli raises the question, is it better to be feared than loved? And the answer, of course, is that fear is better, but at all costs one must avoid hatred. So suddenly, the fortress becomes a material embodiment of this hatred, or the possibility of this hatred, especially if the fortress is built in order to prevent, as a shield, let's say, against the people's hatred to the prince, because it's a sign of the oppression of the prince over the people, or at least the lack of the people's friendship. So of course, this is important insofar as it highlights Machiavelli's general project. Yes, the prince is in search of a prince, of a new prince, but at the same time, this prince has to be a popular prince. And the popular prince, the prince perhaps as the singular founder, as the extraordinary creator of a new state, but once that moment of foundation, of that creation is achieved, the prince has to be one who is able to popularize himself, to gain the support of the people, and not simply their consent to his own rule, but as we shall see, their active support in the form of military support. So the same theme of fortresses is taken up in the discourses, which of course is also a testament to the continuity between the prince and the discourses against a significant portion of the secondary literature on Machiavelli, which tries to posit a significant wedge between the two works. At least from the perspective, if we take the fortress as an image, as a metaphor of government seriously, we can see that in the discourses there is actually a whole chapter dedicated to the issue. So the title of the chapter is Fortresses in General Are Much More Harmful Than Useful, which confirms and in fact sharpens some of the comments that Machiavelli put forth in The Prince regarding the fortress. Here, of course, the sharpening happens by way of showing how really the fortress is an index of the oppression, the material proof of the oppression of the ruler as an indication of his necessity for self-protection. Especially if this self-protection is from his own people, it becomes a sign that he's a bad ruler. Or he doesn't necessarily call him a tyrant, but it's sort of an index of cruelty and tyranny. So, for example, Machiavelli will say that when a prince or a republic is afraid of its subjects and fears they may rebel, the root cause of this fear must lie in the hatred which such subjects have for their rulers, a hatred which is due to their misbehavior, and a misbehavior which is due to their fancying they can hold them by force, or to their foolish way of governing them. And one of the things that makes rulers believe in force is the fact that they have fortresses to fall back on. So all of this is to say that the metaphor of the fortress, which initially appears as a simple reflection on military technology, turns out to be a significant symptom of government in Machiavelli's thought. And of course, one should say that the fortress is only one such metaphor, and Machiavelli's work is scattered with a lot of metaphors that work in a very similar way.